All right, so let's dive right into the anatomy. My absolute favorite subject in the world is neuroanatomy. When I took my first class, wow, it just opened my eyes. I just absolutely adore this subject. So we see our basic picture of the brain here, showing you the very most basic structures. There are three major portions of the brain that we're going to divide this presentation up into. We will be talking in future videos about the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and this one and a couple of subsequent ones are devoted to the brainstem. So in the cerebrum, we of course have most of the volume of the brain involved here. We also have these specific structures that are part of it. We'll cover those in due time. The cerebellum contains, in this small area, contains half of the neurons found in the entire brain. This picture that you see, half of the neurons are compacted within this region. And finally, we hit the brainstem. If we remove the cerebrum and the cerebellum, what is left over, in the definition used by this book, is called the brainstem. This doesn't necessarily correlate with other books, other reference books that you may come across, but nonetheless is of importance to us since our book does do that. Here are those three major areas. The brainstem that we'll see is formally defined as beginning where the foramen magnum occurs, right here, the foramen magnum. Then below that will be the spinal cord, and above that will be the brainstem. The cerebrum that occupies most of the volume, and then the cerebellum over in this area. So the brainstem is composed of the medulla oblongata, this region right in here, the pons, the midbrain that we'll be talking about, and then the diencephalon to some degree. And it's the diencephalon that largely differs between books. This is new for me for it to be considered as part of the brainstem. However, what we should note about activities and functions of the brainstem is that if you have damage in this area due to a stroke, which would be a stoppage of blood flow for some reason or another, or perhaps a lesion occurs in this area, if those are in the correct places in the medulla oblongata, then you will die because you are going to disrupt some incredibly basic and absolutely required functions for your life. So the brainstem, divided up into the four parts here: the medulla oblongata, that's the subject of this video, the pons, the midbrain, and the diencephalon that we'll be talking about in a future video. All right, just some different reference pictures for you here, an MRI showing you the exact locations, and we see the different locations in the different, or the same location in the different pictures. So here is a slice from the medulla oblongata, very near where the foramen magnum divides the medulla oblongata from the spinal cord. And we'll see that are still present. We have those tracts we talked about in the spinal cord. Sometimes the tracts become differently named up here in the medulla oblongata, and we'll certainly deal with that a little bit, but not too much. It's going to be slightly wider than the spinal cord because this is the beginning of the brain. It's going to continue to widen as we move more in a superior direction. The pyramids are found right here, and they're very important because they are where decussation occurs. Remember that term, decussation, is when fibers from this side will cross over into the other side. Remember, the left half of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right half of the brain controls the left half of the body. And so for motor outputs, if the left side of the brain is sending outputs down, they'll cross over to skeletal muscles. They'll cross over here. So these pyramids are where decussation occurs, and they appear almost as baseball bats. We'll see it in an external view here in just a minute. So this again is where descending pathways cross over or decussate. In the medulla oblongata, why is it so important? Well, your heart rate is controlled here. You have centers that will control speeding up the heart rate, slowing down the heart rate. You'll have centers in your medulla oblongata that control the extent of your blood vessels, whether they dilate or constrict. That's called the vasomotor center. The setting of your respiratory rhythms, your basic respiratory rhythms, are determined here. The number of seconds that you inhale, the number of seconds that you exhale, this is all determined by these respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata, and with some help from centers in the pons that we'll talk about next video. Finally, there are some reflex centers here in this lowest region of the brain, and we discussed those to some extent in the previous chapter. So again, you can see how if we had damage here, we are disrupting some very basic functions. There's also some tickling centers here, itching centers, your gagging centers, some very basic sleep centers. These are all found in the medulla oblongata. So things that are absolutely essential and critical to your survival will be found in this region. So we'll end up this video by looking at this picture, and we see how the purple from the green, this is where the foramen magnum is going to occur at. Below that is the spinal cord. Above it begins our medulla oblongata that's in the dark green here. We see the pyramids, these two little baseball bat structures where decussation is occurring in motor fibers that are going from the brain, from the cerebrum, and potentially the cerebellum, down to the spinal cord. We also see lots of these structures. These are called cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of them, and we'll be discussing them in the last video or two of this chapter. Next, we'll be looking at the pons, and in the future, the midbrain and diencephalon.